which will be now. All right, so like I said, if you got a Bible, the book of Genesis, we are going to be in the book of Genesis until May. And so we're going to go all the way to May, the book of Genesis. Then we'll be looking at 2 Peter. We'll be back in Psalms in the summer. And then I don't know if I should say this out loud, but I'm tempted a year from now to start looking at the book of Revelation. We'll see how that goes. I don't think I told Pastor Steve that yet, so he's somewhere like shaking in his boots, like, what are you thinking, right? And while that may seem like a long time to be in one book until May, when you were talking about a book of the Bible that is like 50 plus chapters, it's actually not that long. And so what we're going to do as we go through this is most weeks, if we can, we will read the whole text. There are a few weeks where we're going to be covering multiple chapters in a week, and we're just not going to be able to read that whole thing on a Sunday morning. And then the other thing that I'll say along with that is there are going to be parts of Genesis that we may not get to in the context of a Sunday morning service. So for example, this morning we're going to be reading Genesis chapter 1, and it's kind of the first of two creation accounts. But what you'll see if you read through it is the beginning of Genesis chapter 2 actually belongs with what's in Genesis chapter 1, and it's on the seventh day God rested. But I'm going to be straight with you. There's no way we're going to have the time to cover this Sunday morning the theme of rest. And so what we've done is I've actually already recorded a video talking about the importance of rest, and that will be posted later this week on Facebook, on YouTube, and you can, during the week, if you would like, go ahead and view that. But it's just to kind of give you an idea of where we're going to be, how we're going to go about things. And with all of that said, Genesis 1:1 says this: "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, 'Let there be light.' And there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, the darkness he called night, and there was evening and there was morning the first day. And God said, 'Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters.' And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse, and it was so. And God called the expanse heaven, and there was evening, there was morning the second day. And God said, 'Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place. Let the dry land appear,' and it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas, and God saw that it was good. And God said, 'Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind on the earth.' And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. There was evening, there was morning, that was the third day. And God said, 'Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night. Let them be for signs and seasons and for days and years. And let them be lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light upon the earth.' And it was so. And God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And God set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. God saw that it was good. And there was evening, there was morning, the fourth day. And God said, 'Let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures. Let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens.' So God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, 'Be fruitful and multiply and fill the waters and the seas. And let the birds multiply on the earth.' And there was evening and there was morning, and it was the fifth day. God said, 'Let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things and beasts of the earth according to their kinds.' And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, over the livestock, and over all the earth, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them. And God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. And have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens, over every living thing that moves on the earth." And God said, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit, you shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so, and God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. It's the word of the Lord to us today. So the book of Genesis, I don't know if you know this, but it was not written in the 20th or the 21st century, right? The reason that this is important is that the mindset of a Hebrew in Palestine sometime between 1200 and 1500 years before Christ, depending on when you date the Exodus, is going to be different than the mindset that you and I have, right? And it's not that the people that Moses, who I strongly believe was the author of Genesis, along with the other first 5 books of the Bible, it's not that they were dumb, it's not that they were ignorant, it's not that they were foolish. Man, they just lived in a different world than we do. Right? A different culture, a different religious mindset. They had different experiences. And so approaching the book of Genesis with an utterly 21st century Western or African or Indian or Filipino set of eyes, right, is going to mess us up. We actually need to do our best to understand what a 13th to 15th century Jew who had just been brought out of a few hundred years of slavery in Egypt towards a land of promise, right, that was going to be surrounded by polytheistic, meaning nations that believed in many gods, polytheistic nations. We got to try and get inside of their minds in order to be able to understand Genesis well. And listen to me. This mental transaction where you try and understand a text in light of who was writing it and when it was written is never going to be perfect. It's just not. But it will help us in faithfully understanding and then applying these texts to our everyday lives. So I want us to have that in mind as we jump into this text that we just read. And then here's the first thing that we're going to draw out of this text. It's this: when God speaks, creation, order, and life follows, right? So you got a different bit of a mindset of a 13th to 14th, 15th century Hebrew when it comes to creation. Man, they are going to have some things that are going on in their minds. Why is that the case? Because in what we call the ancient Near East, the time and the place when this was written, creation accounts were chaotic, right? They were the result of some sort of conflict, of weird events among various gods, and humanity was usually some sort of after result. They were created to appease, or they were basically an accident or an act of rebellion. Right, so if you are familiar at all, for all 2 of you who have studied ancient Near Eastern Mesopotamian creation accounts, right, you get that in the Enuma Elish, which is the Babylonian creation account. You get that in the Atrahasis epic, which is the Akkadian creation account. And then, man, you also get that in the Egyptian creation myth around the god named Atum or Atum Ra. That one in particular is messed up, all right? Creation in this religion, according to the Egyptians, is essentially the result of the god Atum or Atum Ra enjoying physical intimacy with himself. All right? And as a result of him having physical intimacy with himself. He creates twin gods named Shu and Tefnut, and then they make more gods, and eventually the entire world comes into being because of a pent-up God. Right? Like it's just it's a bizarre creation myth. I don't know about you, but I take the modern creation myth of descending from the gods called primordial soup and chance every time over being the result of Atum Ra's individual pleasure time. Right? Like I'll take one of those over the other. But these are the type of creation accounts that surrounded the people who are first reading the book of Genesis when Moses sits down and pens it after what's happened. They've been brought out of the land of Egypt into and towards the land of promise. That's their context. They hear these myths where there is chaos, where there's stuff where you're like, oh, that's weird and even gross, right? And man, Moses sits down and he writes what? In the beginning, God spoke and it happened. Not many gods, but one God. Not some cosmic battle or rebellion or last-minute peace treaty where man is made to do the work of lesser gods, but purpose and joy and relationship. This is what Moses is beginning to pressure his readers towards. And what I fear is a lot of times when we come to Genesis 1, especially in the West, we miss this because we want to argue over other things, right? A big discussion with evangelicalism over the last 40, 50 years is whether or not the days in Genesis 1 are literal 24-hour periods, right? That's a big discussion. That's not unimportant, but that's not actually the primary thing that Moses is trying to get across 1,500 years before Jesus shows up, right? Rather, that conversation is one that's largely reading our own presuppositions and issues into the text rather than allowing the text that Moses was writing, that God was speaking to the way that it would have spoken to 13th and 14th century Jews. So track with me for a minute and I'll illustrate this. About a decade ago, a buddy of mine called me up. He's like, hey, listen, we're taking a group of people on a missions trip to Juarez, Mexico. And would you be interested in joining us? Like our two churches could team up and we could go together. And so I was like, yeah, you know what? I'd be interested in doing that. And so I recruited these two young dudes. And I'm not going to lie to you. It was the missions trip from hell. All right? One of these young guys was on probation. We were taking a bit of a chance, kind of bringing him along and investing in him. It did not go well. All right? My wallet went missing about 2 hours into the trip. I am strongly suspicious. I know what happened. Right? I got sick as we were leaving town. We got into Mexico, and I'm like, at least we're going to have good weather. Man, it rained, and it was like the one morning we woke up, there was frost. Right? I'm like, this is not what I imagined this being, right? But in the midst of that trip where my buddy still talks, he was like, man, I remember that trip, and if the Catholics are right and purgatory's real, like you've got a free get out of jail free card right there on that trip. It was that bad, right? But I remember being on that trip, and one of the things that I watched happen was this young guy who is, not a lot of intercultural experience, ended up really bonding with one of the other young guys who was from Mexico, who was part of the family that we were building a house for. And you watched, it was kind of interesting to watch because, man, they didn't speak the same language at all, right? And I remember this guy would come up to me and he'd be like, man, mi amigo over there says, gracias, or hola. My Spanish is terrible, I'm sorry, right? And I'm like, that's great. And it's like they couldn't talk to each other, and yet somehow they were like joined at the hip. It just worked, right? But I remember looking at that and thinking, sometimes I think that's a little bit like what we do with the text of Scripture. We legitimately care about it. We legitimately have an affection for it. We know that it's one of the largest parts of developing a relationship with God and knowing Him, right? But on some level, we're speaking different languages. We ask the text to answer questions which aren't unimportant, but man, it's not actually trying to tell us, and the Bible gives us innumerable answers. It does, but what happens is we oftentimes isolate text and sometimes refuse to hear the language that the text is speaking. So rather than going, man, holy smokes, I read the book of Genesis and see that God is creator, and Genesis is utterly different than other creation narratives. I see that he speaks in creation and order and life happen. We're like, man, are the days literal 24-hour periods? And if your answer to that is different than mine, we're fighting. I'm going to blog. I'm going to YouTube about it. I'm going to take your pick. And the text is like, man, you don't understand what I'm primarily trying to say. It's not about the days. It's about what's happening. It's about the fact that God is creating. And then even though I'm saying this, we get so culturally entrenched in certain questions that you also have to answer them anyways. So when it comes to the days in Genesis 1, Christians who are biblically conservative, meaning they believe the Bible is actually God's spoken word, that it really means what it says, that all of it is breathed out by God, differ on their interpretation of the days in Genesis 1. I'm going to say this to you. That is not an issue that should divide fellowship, right? So listen to me today. If you are an old earth believer who thinks the days aren't 24-hour periods, listen to me. Young earth believers are not all a bunch of dummies with their heads stuck in the sand. And if you are a young earth believer who holds to a literal 24-hour day, your old earth brother and sisters are not abandoning the authority of Scripture. I'll make this very clear, and like this might grind some people's gears. There's kind of a divide that happens here. In modern scholarship, the primary view that modern scholars hold in regard to the book of Genesis is that the days are not 24-hour literal periods. Within the lay community, those of us who are not scholars, most people lean towards a 24-hour literal day, right? That's just for your information for free. You could do with that what you want to do. At the end of the day, this is not an issue that should divide fellowship. And we could dive into so much depth on this, but we still got a lot to cover, so let me just say this, and we'll kind of come back to this text that God is creator. If, on a cosmic level, God speaks and creation and order and life follows, do you not think that it stands that he will be able to bring those things into being here and now? Right, even though we live in a fallen world, God is still speaking. God is still creating. God is still ordering and bringing life. Right? This is how we begin to pull this text into our modern context. And the primary way that he does this is through Jesus revealed in the scriptures, right? So Hebrews 1:1-2 says this, long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. The author of Hebrews is going, all this is about Jesus. And God speaks to us through Jesus. And so when we look back all the way at the book of Genesis in chapter 1, God is speaking to us about Jesus even then. And then listen to me, I'm going to go out on a limb and say this. All of this, when we come back to Genesis 1, and when I say all of this, I mean God literally spinning planets into orbit, creating the universe. All of this is maybe a little bit more significant than your individual and personal reality. Right? Like it's not that you are insignificant, but we are talking an unimaginable difference of scale. Right? We're talking your life, your victories, your defeats, your concerns, your anxieties, your happiness versus the universe. So let me ask you this morning. With that perspective in mind, the fact that God speaks and creation and order and life follow, on a cosmic, literally universal scale, why are you worried? Why are you defeated? Why have you stopped believing? Why have you stopped praying? Why? Our God, the God that you and I serve, speaks and creation bursts forth. Chaos gives way to order. Life inhabits the far corners of the earth. Listen to me. If he has got that, he's got you. He's got you. And listen to me, that doesn't mean that everything will always go exactly the way that you want it to go. Right? Like we talked about John the Baptist last week. John the Baptist was faithful. Jesus referred to him as the greatest among men, and his head was cut off. Doesn't mean everything will always go the way that you want it to go, but it does mean that you know who holds your tomorrow. He's got you. He's got you today, he's got you the day after that, and the day after that, and the day after that, until your lungs stop breathing and your heart stops beating. Friend, listen to me. He has got you. He's the one who has brought you out of slavery into promise and is speaking into your life. And then the second thing we draw to this text is the way that he's got you is the gospel. And the gospel is present in Genesis chapter 1. Right? Oftentimes I think we believe on some level, we're like, man, the gospel doesn't really show up until the New Testament. Or we think or we believe, man, the gospel doesn't really start showing up until maybe, the Passover and God leading the people of Israel out of slavery. That's when you begin to see it. But I'm going to tell you this. The gospel shows up in Genesis chapter 1. So here's how this happens. For an ancient Near Easterner, two things are bad bueno. That's my poor use of Spanish. I told you it was bad. Dark and the sea, right? They are used, those two things, dark and sea or dark and deep, are used pretty consistently in all of biblical language to depict evil and death. Right? So the sea is often talked about as the place of the dead. The dark is, it's dark. We still get that, right? To lack color or to lack light is a common typology we use, right? So when I go to a coffee shop and I order my coffee and I say, man, I want it black like my soul, everybody gets that, right? It's a dark joke. And everybody here under 40 is like, you're a ginger, you don't have a soul. At which point I hang my head in shame, go home and cry later. But we should be able to understand some of why that mindset existed, right? Track with me for a minute. I shared, I don't know how long ago, this story of my buddy one time calling me up and inviting me to go on a houseboating trip on Shuswap Lake. And it was fantastic. It was great. But one of the things that happened on this trip is we were out on the water. We had these two relatively large houseboats. And Shuswap Lake is a big lake. It could get rough. This storm rolled in. And I'm not a seafaring fellow, right? Some of you will maybe balk at my description, but it had to be 3 or 4 foot swells on Shuswap Lake. And you're in these boats that are on pontoons. They are not meant for handling water. And this happens as it's beginning to get dark, and they've got these little radio things, and they call out from their home station, and they're like, hey, don't try and beach the boats in this. That will go poorly for you. Stay out on the water. So we're in this boat, and it's getting dark and gets dark, and these 3 foot plus swells are making this boat it was uncomfortable. And I remember it was funny because we were with these super charismatic Americans, and the girls were over praying in their prayer language. They all thought they were going to die. I think as an 18 or 17 or however old dude I was probably poking a little bit of fun and being like, yeah, last year one of these went over. Same type of situation, right? But it was uncomfortable. It's dark, and you go over there, it's bad news, right? And that is in a boat that has a motor and lights. Now, I want you to think about 1,500 years before Jesus shows up. There is no flashlight. There dang well isn't no motorboats, right? So all of a sudden, you can begin to see where dark and deep become even more terrifying. And they have deadly connotations for a person in the ancient Near East. This is why in Matthew 14, when Matthew's writing and the disciples are rowing the boat and they look over and Jesus is just kind of walking on the water hey guys, what's up? They all freak out. They are rowing on the land or the place of the dead, the sea where ghosts walk, and they look over and see somebody walking on the water. They're like, the stories are true. We're going to die, right? This is the kind of mindset that exists. And then into all of that context, I want you to hear this with me again, Genesis 1:2. The earth was without form and void. Darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. And then down to verse 9, and God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together in one place. Let dry land appear, and it was so. And then down to verse 20, and God said, let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures. So in creation, God speaks, and light permeates the darkness. Land comes up out of the water, and life fills the sea. With the breath of his mouth, the places that ancient Near Easterners viewed as terrifying places of death are not only told what their limits are, they are filled with life. And we see that the nature of God is to work, God's work is to take what is dead, to take what is terrifying, to take what is stigmatically just bad, and to make it alive, to make it habitable, and to call it good. Friends, this is exactly what God does for us in Jesus. He takes spiritually dead people and makes them alive. He shines his light into dark hearts. He brings order out of chaos. And again, if on a cosmic level he can do that, he can absolutely do that in your life. He can bring life. He can bring order. He can bring light. He does it through Jesus. And again, it's not that everything in your life is immediately perfect when you turn your life over to Jesus. The fall, Genesis 3, which we'll talk about in a couple of weeks, means we face problems until we die or until Christ returns. But it does mean that he miraculously and continuously brings life and light and order into our lives, even in the midst of darkness, death, and chaos. And then the last thing that we'll draw out of this text is that man is unique in creation. And before we even go there, I just want to back up for a second. And I want to make sure that you understand this. Some of you feel like when you look around, all you see is darkness, or all you see is chaos, or all you see is death. I am telling you right now, and I want to be as clear as I possibly can be, Jesus changes that. He brings a resurrection, creation-oriented reality into your life. He has done that time and time and time again. He can do that for you. All right. The last thing we draw out of this text is that man is unique in creation. One of the things that was relatively common in Mesopotamia, ancient Near East, was to have a graded view of humanity. So in the same way that you would look at the polytheistic nations around Israel and nations that believed in many gods, and they had this kind of pantheistic caste where some gods were higher than others and some gods were lower, that type of mentality also applied to society. So there were people who were high up in the caste system, and there were people who were, they were the bottom of the barrel. But there was no equality, there was no idea of people are relatively equal in ancient Near Eastern religions. Some people were just inherently better than others, and some were worse. In contrast to that, the Genesis account gives all people a unique dignity. Why? Because man is created in the image and the likeness of God. So every single person has value. Every single person has a sense of equality. Why? Because all of us carry the image of God. We were created not by accident, not as a bargain between deities so that there wouldn't be servants, not graded based on whether you were a man or woman or slave or free or king or peasant. The Genesis account was absolutely, phenomenally earth-shaking in the ancient Near East. Why? Because it said all people are created in God's image. And I think we've heard this kind of idea so often in the West, even though we bugger it up, that we're like, oh, people are equal, that we don't realize just how radical that type of thought was when the book of Genesis was written. This is earth-shaking. All people created in the image of God. And then there's a few things that we learn from that. First is this. Humanity is not then, in a Christian worldview, a virus, a disease, or a problem that needs to be managed. Right? You will hear people talk about things like overpopulation. You will hear people say, man, the most ridiculous things about how we have to call the population of humans, of people. It's just bizarre. It does not jive with what the text of Scripture says. We are the image bearers of God, created with dignity and a mandate to exercise dominion over creation on God's behalf. Right, so you even take this farther, and the mindset that exists in much of the Western world that says, man, if we just leave things alone, especially nature, it'll be fine, or it'll even do better. That isn't actually the way that God created the earth. He created the earth with caring managers, human beings, cultivating it for their benefit and for its own. Second, I want you to get into your heart and your mind how important this is in light of our culture's shift towards wantonly ending life. We live in a culture that, if it doesn't tolerate, sometimes celebrates things like MAID and abortion. Those things don't come close to jiving with the text of Scripture. Because every time a human life is snuffed out, it is an erasure of God's image on the earth. It's not a good thing. It's not a utilitarian thing. It's not a merciful thing. It is an ungodly thing to be mourned. And then third and last, if you struggle with your own value, which I know, man, some of you do. This is the reality of the world that we live in. Some of you have been beaten up. You have been told that you are worthless. You have had experiences that make you think that you are less than. I want you to listen to me. You are created in the image of the God of the universe. So the next time in your head where you hear that voice or somebody tells you you are not worth something, I want you to remember this. The God of the universe made you to look like He looks. Not in a physical sense, but the fact that you hear means that God hears. The fact that you have eyes to see means that God sees. The fact that you speak means God speaks. The fact that you are able to process things means that God is a God who thinks. All of these things you carry around, literally pointing to the God of the universe, and that means that you have value. Not because of what you do, not because of how you look, not because of anything that you achieve, but because you were created in the image of the God of the universe, and no one can take that from you. The most degrading act, the most degrading word, the most degrading thought cannot erase the image of God that you bear. You are valuable. And that's not just to pump your tires and give you some sort of self-help. Your value is tied to who He is. Your value is calling you to recognize who the Creator is and to turn to Him day after day after day. Recognizing that the ultimate expression of who God is Jesus Christ, and that when you turn to Jesus, you are more human and more functional than you ever would be apart from Him, because you are coming back to what God has created you for. Your very existence says that there is a good, a loving, a purposeful, a speaking, a creating God. He's calling you to recognize who He is, and is telling you you have value, and He has sought you out. Through the life, through the death, through the resurrection, through the ascension and coming return of Jesus Christ. So as we venture through the book of Genesis together, Now we're going to see things unfold around this creator God. We're going to see the gospel begin to take place already in the book of Genesis. We're going to see his plan for creation and his created beings. But this morning, what I want to invite you to is to again recognize who he is. He is the one who speaks things into existence. He is the one who brings light into dark places. He is the one who brings life into dead places. He is the one who created you in his image. And I want you to stand with me this morning, and we are going to declare that together. Let's sing.